Now, Dr. Amrita is a TEDx speaker, so she is also a general practitioner and a dedicated wellbeing expert, positive psychology coach, and accomplished portfolio GP. So she's conducted groundbreaking research on post-traumatic growth in doctors with invisible disability, and she's published in the British Journal of Health Psychology. She's co-chair of the Disabled Doctors Network and lead at the Joyful Doctor, and actively promotes equality and is a disability advocate. So Amrita is going to be talking about invisible disability, challenging bias to enable change. And it's going to be in 3 parts. Amrita's going to be talking about her research, and then going to be talking about publication and how she went about publication. And I think that's something that's very interesting to all of us as neurodivergent people. And then she's going to talk about what happened next after that. So over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's really great to be here. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much to Catherine for inviting me. Since I met Catherine, she's been such a positive influence in my life. And now that I've met her, I'm never letting go of her. So just wanted to thank Catherine for her support and invitation. So as Catherine mentioned, I'm going to talk about, I suppose, my research journey in 3 parts. The first part will be about my research, what my findings were. The second part will be about the road to publication, which was quite difficult. And the third part is going to be what happened next, as Catherine said. Can I just ask, because there's a small group of us, if you don't mind saying, either writing in the chat or unmuting yourself, is there anything that is there anything that you particularly want to hear from me? Because I'd like to make sure that I'm meeting the expectations of the audience, and answering the questions that you might have. So is there anything?
Yeah, I would like to kind of hear your experience of kind of working as a doctor, and also to talk about where there may be a difference of opinion. So it's just something that kind of always fascinates me, where sometimes professionals can have different opinions on subjects, but just looking at the wider perspective, because obviously some conditions like autism or ADHD are not necessarily visible, and indeed dyslexia is not visible on the surface level when you're just looking at someone, but when you're working with them, the symptoms and so on may be more so noticeable if you're looking at an essay. So for example, because I work with university students, but
yeah. So sorry, Andrew. The question is about my experience as a doctor, or
yeah, as a doctor meeting people. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
You're interested in knowing if there's a difference of opinion in the medical profession, and how Amrita as a doctor has dealt with that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I will go through that, and then if I don't answer that, so if I'm not answering that, happy to pick that up at the end, or even have an offline conversation with you if you think that there are certain questions that kind of come up during the talk. Thank you, Andrew, for coming out and saying what you want to hear from this. Is there anyone else who's got anything in particular?
Joyce, can I just ask what issues you have faced yourself, and how you deal with the conflicts that arrived, and how you problem solve?
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Joyce. Hopefully, again, the presentation will answer those. But if it doesn't, then please remind me at the end to pick those threads up.
The reason why I say that is because sometimes people don't just have a diagnosis of non-neurotypical, and even if they do have a diagnosis of non-neurotypical, there are many layers to it. And then if you've got additional health problems on that, is about, because one's working in the medical field, how do they adjust and treat you as a person?
Hopefully I can answer all those very important questions. I'll see if I can do all of your curiosity justice. So I'm going to speak. I don't have much information on my slides. There are a few slides that are very information heavy. I do apologize for that, because I appreciate that isn't helpful for a lot of people. But it's just to show you the kind of pathway that I've had to go through to get to to the point of where I am in terms of being having my research published. So I'm going to start as I mean to go on. And I basically speak in visual metaphor. So Catherine's given me a really kind introduction. I'm not here as any kind of expert. I'm here as a peer, as a neurodivergent doctor. Only found out that I had dyslexia in 2019, which is when I started working with Catherine. Although I did know it my whole life, it wasn't ever something that was inverted commas diagnosed, or I wasn't offered a label. I wasn't offered the information about how my brain worked, however you want to put it. But the rationale behind me saying that is that we're all here to learn and to share. And one of the reasons that I wanted to come here today when Catherine invited me was because it would have been really helpful for me to hear somebody like me speak a few years ago. And it would have been really helpful for me to see a role model who was from a minority group, an ethnic minority group, somebody who was, a doctor, somebody who was neurodivergent, somebody who did have chronic health issues, and who was proud of saying that. So I just want to try and offer the space its due attention, because this is something that I couldn't find for myself. So, and essentially, I digress, but collectively we can work together to try and challenge the bias and work in a way that enhances and strengthens that golden thread that connects us, essentially, which today is our neurodivergent characteristics or strengths. So this is me. As Catherine said, I'm a TEDx speaker. I'm a positive psychology practitioner. I am still a portfolio GP. I do less work in general practice nowadays. I do have a role as being the co-chair of the Disabled Doctors Network. Now, why have I written all of those labels on this slide here? Why am I telling you all of this? Because actually, does it really matter? Well, to be honest, I believe it does. I believe that it gives context to the story about what I'm going to share today. And it brings to life the intertwined facets of what my research was actually based on and what my findings were all about. My introduction essentially highlights the manner in which we structure our understanding of society, the fact that we all have an external identity, and that's how people receive us, by what they see. And sometimes what you see is not what you get. And people are not always open to that. People make a lot of assumptions based on how we look, our external identities. So why is it that we tell people what we do rather than who we are? I've done a lot of reflection on this. I don't have the academic answers, but I think sometimes maybe the group of us in this room, the people who watch the recording, recognize that we are not all offered equal privilege. And actually, to be yourself, to be your authentic self, to present yourself in the world just as you are, exactly how you want to be seen, isn't something that is offered to everyone. That privilege is not always offered to everyone. And so this understanding, this concept of an external identity actually becomes really important. What do you put out there that allows people to connect with you? So I'm going to post some questions for you. I'd like you to think about them as we go through the discussion today. How much of yourself do you choose to offer the world? How much of that offering, how much of what you put out there is readily received, is received with acceptance? How much of yourself do you choose to keep invisible from the world? So how much of yourself do you choose not to put out there? And how much of yourself is kept invisible, not because of your choice, because the world is not ready to receive? So these questions are quite challenging, but actually I think resonate with so many of us who are living with invisible disability or invisible characteristics. So as I said, my story is going to be in 3 parts. The first is going to be looking at my research, finding the path or navigating the path. The second is going to be staying the course, getting published, which was very, very difficult. And the third is finding the rainbow. So what has happened since then? So I hope it's enjoyable to you. So finding the path, my research. Well, there were lots of facets that came into my desire to conduct research. I'm a portfolio GP. I trained in medicine for years. I had 2 children. During my pregnancies and maternity leaves, unfortunately, I became quite unwell. So I had gone from having, for want of a better description, a normative perspective on a neurotypical perspective on life, an understanding that I was blessed without having any chronic illnesses. And I came from a very privileged position where my parents offered me a very good education. And when I say good education, I mean at home. They filled me with a lot of love. They filled our house with a lot of harmony. My parents were from different religions. They showed me what real acceptance and gratitude and non-judgmental behavior really was. And all of this was in light of living in a very racist culture, being one of 9 girls, brown girls in my school. So, you know, all the difficulties that I faced in life were actually tempered by the love that I had when I went home. And the reason I say that, the reason I'm mentioning this is it will become apparent later. But just wanted to highlight that I was very fortunate and very privileged to have the love of my parents and my sister, which for me was a huge support system. Anyway, we'll fast forward a few years and my father passed away. That was a very difficult time for me. We'll fast forward another few years and I had a very difficult time during my pregnancy at work. I was unwell, and with this illness, I experienced an identity shift. I'd gone from being, as I mentioned, neurotypical, not having any health difficulties, to actually recognizing that my brain wasn't working in the same way anymore. My brain wasn't doing what it had always done for me. And in that constant companion that I had of a bit of my brain, my intelligence, my cognition. Sorry, intelligence, I don't mean intelligence in terms of academic, I mean in terms of being able to process the world around me. All of that fell apart because of my illness. And because of the fact that I lost my father, it was very difficult to find that safety net. It was very difficult for me to find that opportunity to just be and just hold myself in a safe space, because I was having to offer that safe space for my family around me. So all of this is grounding, and all of this is sowing the seeds, sowing the threads, combining the threads together of why I went and conducted my research. So I was in a position where I experienced not only an invisible disability of having a neurodivergent characteristic and recognizing that my brain wasn't working in the same way that it used to, but I also developed epilepsy as well, following the birth of my first child. Unfortunately, despite my advocacy and self-advocacy, it wasn't recognized by my peers, by my colleagues, and by the people who were looking after my health. And it was somewhat minimized. This impacted my self-esteem. And this is one of the reasons why I mentioned my family and the security that my family gave me, because that security had eroded. And once that security had eroded, any kind of chip that occurred in my external identity, whether that be health, whether that be love, whether that be criticism, whether that be somebody not believing what I was saying, really shook the ground that I was standing on. So I'm speaking a lot of metaphor, but what essentially I'm trying to say is that my whole framework and understanding of who I was completely changed and shifted. At this point, I realized that it's only going to, my life, my ideas about the world are only going to change if they come from within. I had to do something to support myself. Obviously, I had the support of my mother and my sister and my husband. If I wasn't going to dig deep, and if I wasn't going to change things for myself, then nobody else was going to. And it was from that education that I had, that love that I had from my family, that I dug into, and that allowed me to pursue my path. So part of finding my path was about finding what my fuel was, where my heart was, and what gave me the impetus to move forward. So quite a sentimental start to the research that I did. So this segues nicely into the title of my research, which was Exploring Post-Traumatic Growth in Doctors with Acquired Invisible Disability. The focus of this research was to explore the actual process and understanding of what post-traumatic growth is. This was a term that I had come across when I started my master's. It was something that I knew existed. It was, what doesn't, the terminology, the saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger by Nietzsche. All of these different kind of quotes around strength comes from adversity really rang true with me. They ring true with so many people, but it was only when I started studying my master's that I realized there was an actual term for this. There was an academic term that had been researched heavily, and that term was post-traumatic growth or adversarial growth. And it was then when I could hang my experiences on a label that I realized that my experiences were not in vain. My experiences were not singular. There was a community of people out there. There was a community of us who had gone through difficulties. And it's the sharing of those stories that brings about the most change in society. And that was what I was really struggling with, society's view of illness and society's view of neurodivergence. So anyway, moving forward, the title of my study was about post-traumatic growth. Now, the important part about post-traumatic growth is not that somebody has a difficult situation, they get over that, and then they have positivity following that, or they have growth following that. It's not about that. It's about recognizing that actually distress will exist, and distress can coexist with positive psychological change. So it's about understanding that the framework of life, the foundations and the sense of safety can be disrupted. They can cause catastrophe, they can cause significant distress, but they can occur in tandem and simultaneously with meaningful personal change. And that was what I was really exploring in this cohort of people. The reason I chose doctors was because I am a doctor. I came from a medical community, but also my supervisor was very smart, and she recognized that I wanted to get a publication. She recognized that for me as a dyslexic individual, getting a publication was a real challenge. And she knew that if she set that challenge for me, set that gauntlet, it would be something that I would try to strive to achieve. And so she said to me, you need to find a topic of research that will be so different to what anyone else has offered the world that they can't say no to you. She said, you need to find a topic to research where people cannot say no to you. Then you'll get published. And she said, what about exploring your own community? What about exploring doctors? She said, nobody knows anything about doctors. Doctors never talk about their lived experience, about their personal experience. She said, and if you think about that aspect and that perspective and that lens, you are offering the world very unique insights. So when you look at me as an individual and look at my profession, you might think, actually, of course, she's done a research topic in doctors because that's her community. But actually, there was a very smart reason behind that. And that reason actually came from my supervisor. It wasn't led by me. I was actually very keen not to be researching doctors. So anyway, this research was an IPA. An IPA is a very intense qualitative analysis of information. And it takes a real deep dive into the lived experience of a very small number of participants, of which in my study there were 5. Now, please don't feel overwhelmed by this slide, and please don't feel that you have to read a lot of it. The reason why I'm putting it up here is because I wanted to highlight the rigor and the specificity that I needed to offer, all of the words that I used, all of the labels that I was using in order to make my research tangible, in order to make it robust and rigorous. This was very hard for me. I found what am I trying to say? It was very hard to put my thoughts down in a linear manner. I didn't think Catherine is witness to this. I don't think in a linear manner. I think very tangentially. Everything that I think makes sense. But when I had to actually concretely put down my thoughts it was very, very difficult for me to do. And I found that that was the biggest challenge. The challenge wasn't the thinking. The challenge was, how do I slow my thoughts down enough to actually make sense of what they are so somebody else can understand what I'm trying to think? Because in my world, everything's just going like this. But how can I expect anyone else to understand or even be interested in what I'm trying to say or what I'm trying to think about if I can't make head nor tail of it? So I found that this was a very, very difficult concept. And I remember this aspect here of cognitive dysfunction. I remember talking to Catherine about it. Catherine was supporting me during my master's. And I remember saying to Catherine, you know, cognitive dysfunction. She was like, I don't understand what that means. She said, you have to spell it out to me. And I said, oh, you know, it's just, and I was giving her a whole constellation of symptoms. And she said, so you have to write that. She said, you can't expect somebody to know what's in your head. And that obviously sounds very simple, of course. How can you expect somebody to understand what's in your head? Actually, that to me was one of the biggest lessons, that sometimes I think people are following me on a journey when actually I've not made it easy for them to do. So I felt actually that was a huge learning for me, recognizing that actually things do need to be crystal clear. The language that we use needs to be clean. We need to use fewer words in order to get our point across. And this was something that I had to learn to do. Now, I'm not saying we have to do that in everyday life. Of course, we need to be authentically who we are. But this was the hurdle I had to overcome in order to get published in a peer-reviewed journal. These were the rigid frameworks which were set before me, the gauntlet that was set before me. If you want to be in a peer-reviewed journal, these are the rules that you've got to follow. And I found that very, very challenging. I hope that makes sense around what I'm saying. So anyway, dialing it back, these were the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. So you find that people have a renewed appreciation for life. So when somebody has a difficulty, when they are able to overcome that because of whatever supportive or resourcing tools they have, you might find that they have an increased appreciation for life. They're open to new possibilities, new opportunities, a change in career, learning new languages, studying, a master's, a diploma, whatever it is that they want to do. Personal strength, that is around the knowledge that you are able to challenge and tackle experiences. Some may call that resilience. Some don't like the word resilience. I actually don't mind the word at all, because it comes from me. It's the intention within which you use words that's the most important aspect of what those words mean. A greater connection to people, and also spiritual or existential growth. So there were 5 domains, and all of my participants had to have at least one of those in order to be considered for the research. There was a new domain as well, which was discussed by my supervisor, Dr. Kate Heffron, and she and her colleague Hannah Kumpman talked about corporeal post-traumatic growth. So in research to date, up until 2012, not to date, the work around post-traumatic growth was around a cognitive change, a positive psychological change, which was related to one's brain and cognition and the way they think. What these 2 amazing researchers and women found was actually the body can go through this as well. Why does post-traumatic growth just have to be in our heads? Why can't it be through our bodies? Why can't it be somatic? Why can't it be through how we move? Why can't it be in how we feel? So it's this connection and relationship and awareness of our body, which they researched. Now, this was really interesting to me because I came from a world of medicine where everything was binary and everything was absolute. That this is the way things are, this is the way diagnoses are. You either fit the box or you don't. You don't fit the box, you don't have it. You fit the box, great, tick, label. So this was really interesting to me. I thought, wow, you can research something that doesn't exist, and you can research something and make a whole new term. This corporeal post-traumatic growth had never been heard before 2012. So I started to get my thinking cap on, and I thought, well, if the body can do that and the cognition can do that, why can't the emotional aspect of our brain do that as well? And so this is where my research came in. And I started to think about, well, if our relationship with our body can allow us to go through post-traumatic growth, what about our relationship with our mind? What about identity change that occurs when we lose part of how we identify with the external world. And if we identify with the external world through our external identity, and that's shifted, what happens then? So this essentially was grounding my research. So the stories of the individuals that I am going to discuss are unique and they're painful, but they are wholly inspiring. So I looked at 5 doctors who experienced post-traumatic growth during their time of working as a doctor within the NHS. And during their time as a doctor within the NHS, they experienced a disability. But as Andrew mentioned, it was that veil, the veil of the physicality prevented others from understanding that they had a disability. No one could see it. And because no one could see it, no one could really understand it. So there were 3 main themes that came from my research. The first was the human left behind. The second was acceptance of the disabled self. So that was around that identity shift. And the phoenix rises from the ashes is essentially the post-traumatic growth aspect. So you've got my research, which was divided into 3. You can see 3 is my magic number here. But it's essentially about what happens when one becomes unwell, the human left behind, the identity shift, the acceptance and welcoming that new change and shift, and then how we can grow from that. And it was interesting because there was a 5 out of 5 prevalence for all of these themes and sub-themes. What that means is each and every participant was found to have a relatedness to each of these themes and each of these sub-themes. So that's really, really powerful as well, because you see how important this common denominator is in the lived experience. But essentially the lived experience and the uniqueness of that could, in my eyes, through my research, be boiled down to these terms. So the human left behind essentially signifies loss. And that loss occurs because of an existential crisis that the doctors were experiencing in trying to understand how that doctor first, human second identity disrupt their way of living. So as a doctor, you have to take a Hippocratic oath. You have to take an oath that you will look after people and you will care for people and you will serve people. And what happens to one's identity is that that identity gets put forward. Actually, you're a doctor first, and everything else about you, the human part of yourself, comes second. And so this was disrupted for people. Their identity of being able to be a doctor was disrupted because of an illness that overtook them. So we can see that the human left behind actually represents an appreciation of the central role that an identity has, external identity. It also represents the fragile identity state that we all have, and that for these groups of people became lost when they acquired a disability. So I have a few quotes here that I wanted to share. So this particular aspect of the research was around understanding that actually their professional and personal identities were so heavily connected to one another, like a DNA double helix, that they didn't know how to separate the personal from the professional self. And you'll find this is quite common with medical professionals. So Dina talked about how that kind of melted away when I became ill, because it didn't matter anymore. She's talking about the fact that she was a doctor. It didn't matter anymore. And it made me lose my identity, because medicine was a big part of who I am. So you can see how tragic this is, that actually an illness makes somebody question who they are, makes somebody question why they're here, makes somebody question what their worth is. And Helen talked about how the understanding of an illness within her was a many-layered thing, because I have a huge understanding of the sort of pathophysiology, the illness, but the experience is an entirely human one. And I put my own expectations on myself because I'm a doctor and I ought to be able to fix it. So you see here the pressure that these doctors put themselves under, because they shouldn't be ill, because they're meant to be in the caring role not in the role where they are being cared for. So there's this understanding that actually it's very, very difficult to have this juxtaposition, this dual identity of being patient and doctor. So I've got a few slides here as well that highlight that actually the identities that were placed upon them from multi-level interactions, personally, professionally, and with societal constructs were very debilitating. And I think it was Joyce who spoke about that, the multifaceted layers of society when she was speaking to me in her question. And this was evident in my participants. Their experiences really shook them, and they had to defend their position. They had to defend their position of illness. Can you imagine? I mean, I'm sure you all can imagine. I don't know why I said that. You know, defending your position of your reality, and because you are not believed, because you are stigmatized so heavily, and still having to prevail through self-advocacy to preserve your own identity. That is significant. So one of these doctors says, my surgical wound is healed. I, the person, am not yet. Really powerful and profound. Another doctor, I know what I'm talking about when I say, I think I have. I think they should just take it with a bit more, they should give it a bit more weight than what they were doing, because some of them were doing the exact opposite. So you can see that even though somebody was a doctor and they knew about pathophysiology, the way in which the body worked, they could align their symptoms with textbook knowledge. They weren't being believed. And not even they weren't being believed, they were actively being disbelieved. And so it's really interesting how you can see that illness can be such a debilitating intersection in one's life for so many different reasons. And it's not only isolated to people who are out of the medical profession, it's in as well. And these tribal behaviors exist as well. These tribal behaviors, this ill treatment from colleagues, was significant, causing this feeling of identity change, that you are no longer part of the gang, no longer part of the crew, no longer part of the professional circles. Now that has a significant effect on self-esteem, that the career, the love of caring for people that you've worked so hard for suddenly is minimized to an extent that you are no longer able to care for others because people are not letting you. People do not let you do your job properly, even though you want to. Even though you can, they're telling you you can't. So many different facets of minimization, discrimination, and marginalization. Acceptance of the disabled self was a second theme, and that depicted the journey of reconnection through self-healing. So that was about the recognition of personal loss. So the loss happened with the human left behind. There was a loss. There was an understanding that there was a loss. The acceptance of the disabled self was about how we can understand the new person, the new identity. So participants saw that this really turbulent journey through illness, which affected their personal, professional, relational stance, actually led them to be very isolated and very lonely. And in that, they lost who they were. So this part of the study was around how they reconnected to their inner selves. How did they do that? And what was it that helped them do that? So this gradual adoption of their illnesses, of their disabilities, of the invisibility of their disabilities, and that's key. It was the invisible aspect of that. That gradual adoption and acceptance of that allowed them to embrace their illness. And that allowed them to recognize that it's only through acceptance they will find meaning and mattering in life. And meaning and mattering are a little bit different. Mattering is about how important are we to others? How important are we to the world, to the universe? Meaning is our understanding of what our meaning in life is and what our purpose in life is and what we're doing for the world. But mattering is how we are impacting on the world in terms of how we feel that we are being perceived. So participant accounts offer powerful insights into their struggles and the invisible nature of the disability. And that seems to be amplified by the fact that they're doctors. So it's interesting that Kirsty, for example, talks about how she had to persuade people. She found the interactions with people very difficult because she had to persuade them, because she was more unwell than she looked. Now, I sense that that is one of the themes that links us all in this room. The fact that you could be struggling in such a way with whatever difference you might have, but no one really understands it because they can't see it. So you could be functioning to a really, really high capacity, but the work that you're putting in to get you to that level is unseen and it's invisible. And that in itself takes its mental toll. That in itself has a significant effect on you. And it's that absence of visual markers that means that you are understood. And this was the same with the doctors. It's the absence of visual markers that meant that it impacted their identity in a way that people couldn't understand. It impacted their function, their inclusion, and their social participation. And it's that part, that social participation, that I think has such an impact on our self-esteem, such an impact on our opportunities, and such an impact on our isolation, that connection that we have. And that's really, really important. Dina, in this particular quote, talks about her solitary journey. She talks about how it's a tough life, and she means she's really, really lonely, because even if people want to understand, they just don't understand your pain because it's invisible. And I found that quote so powerful. The sub-theme is a metaphor describing that inflection point from which participants nurture a new relationship with themselves. So from which their journey in distress stage starts to move to acceptance. Essentially, they can then move forward in their functional role. It starts with me and it ends with me. So this is essentially what I was alluding to, the fact that change cannot happen until acceptance occurs. So that was a really important part of that trajectory. This part was about the labeling. Now, some people find labeling debilitating, but in this particular study, what I found was that labels offered powerful shifts in mindset for these doctors who were disbelieved and who had to prove time and time again that their experiences were real. So the license of a label offered psychological emancipation and personal liberation. And specifically for doctors in this study, that medical narrative offered that validation, so that a colliding of the theoretical knowledge with the personal experience actually for them made their experiences far more valid.
Should we just open that up, Amrita, if that's okay?
Please.
To ask others here, how do they feel about labels? I mean, clearly, you know, what Amrita's saying is, from her research, a label could be a blessing, actually. How do people in this Zoom room feel about labels?
I see them as part of a vehicle, as a way of accessing support. So say, for example, without having a clinical sort of diagnosis of Asperger's, I wouldn't be able to join in and meet with other people in the local community. And it does also provide access to other support. And the same with like dyslexia. With that, I think it's different for each disability, to be honest, because dyslexia then tends to have more of a positive kind of focus overall, in my kind of experience. But at the end of the day, once you've got a label, it can then explain things, and it's what you do next that's fundamentally important. I had 7 years from getting my clinical diagnosis of Asperger's and then finally studying a postgraduate certificate in autism 7 years later to actually fully understanding it. Whereas with my dyspraxia diagnosis, that was explained straight away. So I have a different perspective on all of my diagnosis, to be honest. So
that's really useful. Thank you, Andrew. Has anybody else got another perspective before we go back to the talk?
I was actually thinking of it changes, did you say diagnosis? Yeah, it changes your inner dialogue. And it gets you to a point where that's where the positive is, depending on where you are. If you are already studying or in work, it can kind of pinpoint you, and kind of, it's like a push up, so to speak. It can really help in that way, for me anyway.
That's a really interesting insight.
Well,
'Cause
Kenya wants to say something.
Yes, I can appreciate I'm speaking from Rwanda. Labels I'm not allowed to use because the government and schools are a bit concerned at the moment. If I use words like dyslexia, dyspraxia, then many of them are not known. But if I do use labels, they're afraid that individuals and families will become ostracized. So what I'm using at the moment as an advocate and trying to create awareness around different learning abilities is just that. Those are the words I use, different learning abilities, and tell stories. A classic one for ADHD as we know it in the West would be to say to somebody, when you were at school, do you remember there was either somebody sitting next to you or in front of you that couldn't concentrate, and they would spend the time talking or shouting or throwing things or doodling. So I have to describe what those other terms that we know look like. So they wouldn't have the same impact as they do in the West. In Rwanda, I just have to describe it, and somebody would say, "Oh, I know, I can understand that." The same with I have a diagnosis of dyslexia, so I have to describe it first and say in other places it might be described as this, and it's always been tentative with the might. I know what it's called, but here in Rwanda, I have to be quite careful.
And that's really important, isn't it? Because it shows the power of language, doesn't it? And that we all have to be in a place, one, where we can receive it, but two, where we understand it. And your colleagues and the people that you work with in Rwanda doesn't mean they don't understand what dyslexia is. It's just the language and the label that we attribute to those descriptions that you're offering aren't in alignment with their understanding. And that's okay, because that's culturally congruent with what's happening in Rwanda. And I suppose that's the highlight of is highlighting how in the medical profession, in these 5 people who I was interviewing, that label was a license to them for them to be unwell. Whereas for many other people, it might not have been. If maybe I was looking at a group of, I don't know, another profession, it might not have the same weight or the same peace offering, should we say, because actually it's not in the context of their profession, if that makes sense. So it's very interesting how language is very powerful depending on which people are using it. Thank you. Was there anything, Catherine, that you wanted to say? Sorry.
I think that was a really important discussion there, because as everybody is saying, language is so important to our identity and our social being as well, and our innermost feelings, as Alicia was talking about.
Yeah. Can I just say something? Sorry, I couldn't find to put my hand up, Joyce.
Sure.
That was my thought. When you was describing what you was previously describing with your change in identity and change of sense of self, and then you talked about a label. So sometimes labeling, in a way, having these new symptoms and not knowing what they are can be really scary. Your persona changes, your psyche changes, and you're lost, and you're I should say you're insecure. That safe space you have isn't there anymore, and then having something that names it may be helpful, but then having something that labels it in terms of how the medical term labels it, you've got to tick and fit into a box, is also really difficult and contradictory at times.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I suppose that was what I was trying to highlight in my explanation that for this group of doctors, actually it wasn't. Not saying that it isn't for other people, but that shows the perspective, should we say, of this particular cohort of people. And I absolutely agree. It's then you have to look at the context of which the research is taken, and this is taken in a very small proportion of people who this language is very relevant to. So, I mean, absolutely, Joyce, and I completely agree with you that boxes are made to be broken, should we say. So moving forward, but thank you very much, because that's really insightful and really important perspective on this. So it's that acceptance of just moving towards the post-traumatic growth aspect before I move on to the personal aspect of my journey. The acceptance of the disabled identity from that kind of place of brokenness, should we say, that's the real word that's there, isn't it? That's the real feeling that we've got from these participants, is essentially understanding that they reconnected through their grief and their joy. And that was not linear. That wasn't that, oh, you know, I've gone through this really difficult situation and now I'm propelling myself forward and I'm going to use all the tools and resources I have, and hey, great, everything's wonderful at the end. It was this understanding that grief and joy occur at the same time. But realigning their values allowed them to recognize what they had been through. And what they had been through was a huge shift in identity, but also recognizing what had happened to their understanding and their relationships with themselves. So in this group of people, their brain and their relationship with their academic intelligence, so I'm speaking specifically from an academic point of view, actually shifted. So Kirsty talks about how in her eyes, in her experience, her brain was something that defined her. That was her external identity, her brain, her intelligence, her academic intelligence. But essentially how then she realizes that she didn't have that. And despite the fact that she didn't have it, it didn't matter, because she was more than that. So again, it's understanding about the fact that their identities were far more than their external identities, than what they were putting out there. And then Kirsty says it's, you know, one of her biggest losses, because she lost a huge part of who she was. She's not known as a doctor anymore, but she's known as somebody who does arts and crafts. And for her, and there's no minimization in that, that's a very important role to have. But for her, it was a very different role to the one that she had envisaged for herself. And so we can see here, there's that flexibility that comes in around the fact that actually whatever we do, as long as we're doing it from heart, it's okay. But for this group of people, it was a very important journey to go on. And then we have this understanding of the somatic, the corporeal post-traumatic growth that I spoke about earlier. So this relationship that one has with their body. And then there's this understanding of the fact that actually whatever is on the periphery doesn't matter. What's in our heart is what is important. So the support that we have, the love that we have, and the fact that we're able to live a life that's authentic. And that was all of these factors put together were around developing that process of post-traumatic growth. And then the final slide about my research essentially was about the fact that there's a recognition that through all of the discomfort and all of the pain, they realized what their true value set was. And that value set to them was about serving. It was about using whatever skills and tools they'd had, whatever life experience and lived experience in the movement forward, and harnessing that in a positive way. And recognizing that they needed to serve in whatever way, shape, or form that would be. So there are lots of things that I haven't discussed in this study, if anyone is interested in reading it. I didn't touch upon ethnicity. I didn't touch upon neurodiversity. I didn't touch upon disability, despite the fact that all of these participants, by definition, fulfilled the Equality Act's definition of having a disability. That was the subject matter. I actually didn't discuss that in the study. I discussed the experience of living with a disability, but not disability in a theoretical and academic context, because to me that wasn't important. It was about the lived experience. What happens to that person? Not how does society view that person? How does that person conform, I suppose? I didn't discuss the intersections of gender, of identity, and of non-binary, and I didn't talk about the attainment gap. And the attainment gap exists when we have people who are from different walks of life, who don't have the same opportunities, and who are affected by illness, or being from a minority group, or experiencing bullying or harassment at work. So these things I wanted to just highlight, that I haven't discussed any of these today, and I haven't discussed any of them in my study, not because they're not important, because it wasn't the focus of the research. And I think it's important to just highlight that it wasn't, it was mindful. It was not researched because there wasn't time to research all of these very, very important factors which need their own spotlight. Not that these factors are not important, but they need their own spotlight, and they need to have time to look at them. That's what I've just discussed there. So staying the course, the road to publication. Is there any questions that anyone has so far? Because I just want to make the next few bits a bit more interactive. So does anyone have any reflections on what I've said so far? Or anything they wanted to share?
Yeah, this woman in the photo, her body language just expresses how I'm feeling at the moment. When you've gone through your research and then you've now said you didn't cover ethnicity, and you didn't cover LGBT, and you didn't cover disability, and I thought that's what we were talking about, disability. Maybe I don't know whether yes, I'm a bit thrown. Maybe I need to watch the video again. This is probably part of my own different learning ability, but I just felt that can we discuss the research without those key components, because they make up an individual.
Do you mind if I just say something here? The research is about disability, but the primary focus of it is about how post-traumatic growth, that's the primary focus of the research for these doctors. So do you want to say a bit more, Amrita?
I mean, I welcome Kenya's challenge, but it's hard to explain in an hour what the whole crux of my research was about. But as Catherine says, it was about post-traumatic growth. It's about the lived experience of somebody having a difficulty, whatever that difficulty is, and moving through to a place of where they experience something called post-traumatic growth, that positive psychological evolution, should we say. The causative factor was disability. The causative factor was the fact that they became unwell. Their illness was so severe that it meant that they had a disability in accordance with the Equality Act. But it could have been something else that I was researching. It was the process of post-traumatic growth. Now, I'm a disabled doctor. I'm somebody who's neurodivergent. I'm somebody who has 3 invisible disabilities. So it's not that I was intentionally wanting to cover something up. It was that wasn't the focus. The focus was on positive psychology and the social mobility model, and the opportunity of understanding what disability is from a positive mindset. All of the research so far with disability in medicine was around looking at it from an ableist perspective, should we say. And I was trying to do something very different. So the other thing, Kenya, is it's not that the research wasn't conducted, it's that it wasn't published. When you're going for publication, you have to narrow your focus down to such an extent. I'll go through that in a moment, and you might see how this starts to become a bit more tangible in terms of the torturous journey that I went on with publication. But you literally have to rip apart every single word, every single sentence that you are offering a journal in order for them to buy into your model, which again is very, very difficult. So you can only look at one focus. You can't look at more than one lens when you are trying to get something into publication. So again, it's not that I don't have the research there, it's that I haven't presented it to a journal for them to publish. So it's like when you're doing a science experiment or something and you say, oh, the limitations of the study are X, Y, and Z. The limitations of my study were that I didn't focus the question on disability, ethnicity, intersectionality, all of those things. Does that make more sense or not?
Yes, I think I'm thinking from my position is I'm a systemic psychotherapist. So I very rarely look at something in isolation. So I think it was a bit, I like that. I keep looking at this photo. So when you listed all the things you'd left out, I thought, what? Yeah, because again, I think with anything, it's impacted by whether your gender, your age, all these have, are influenced in our identity and how,
Yes,
how we survive our whatever
I
we're
don't
going
think
through.
I don't think I said that wasn't important. I don't think I said that I didn't understand how that impacted. I said that I didn't use the research, I didn't use studies to support that aspect of the research in my publication, because that wasn't the focus of the question.
Okay, I appreciate your research and your findings. I was just sharing my views.
And that's good. And thank you, Kenya. That's because actually you're both coming from a kind of different professional lens, aren't you? Can you just repeat so that people kind of understand where you're coming from a bit better? Can you repeat the focus of your research question? Just say it out loud, Amrita.
So my research question was exploring post-traumatic growth in doctors with acquired invisible disability.
Right, so it's acquired, okay? So people have become, because they're so ill, they have become disabled. And from what working with Amrita, it was very much about researching the post-traumatic growth that is not available actually within the medical profession. There's not. And that was one of the findings for Amrita actually. What do you want to, Alicia? Did you want to say something?
Yes, you wanted for someone to update you on how the talk has gone so far. And the 4 questions that you had at the beginning, it definitely resonated with me. And although I can't answer them because they're very personal, definitely resonated with me. And I like your views on how important, the importance of how you put love more than what you do, because it's just a different framework. And I definitely reflected with that. And post-traumatic growth, I felt that, but I never had a name for it. Definitely was a struggle, I will say, especially around groups, especially when you have an invisible illness. It is a lonely walk. And the question for me sometimes is, do people have to experience what you're going through, especially if you look well? Do people have to experience what you're going through? Because especially when it's intermittent or you're managing, or because the managing and what you are actually doing is actually helping people who are struggling and they are lonely to get to that next level of support. And I think it's so important. Because the self-talk, when someone is actually experiencing that they're trying to reach another level and they appear well, is because they actually, it depends on their base point, who they were before and who they are now. Although they've got an invisible illness, they may be not quite 100% of themselves, but they may be 70, 80% of what they used to be, as in like vibrancy, happiness, all the things that make you a healthy individual and being able to be a part of society. Yeah, I think that's all I've written. I think it's pretty good. Yeah, thank you.
Do you think do you think society is ready?
I think changes is coming about because I'm hearing from the doctor that's embarking in something new. And I think society is the consciousness of everyone. I think it will change as if something like this is already out there. I think there definitely is going to be a change. Maybe not now. It may take a while, but a change will happen definitely.
I mean, it's a huge subject, isn't it? And it's a huge subject that Amrita has opened out. I mean, what we've found from Amrita's research is that the medical profession are not ready for doctors to actually be disabled themselves. They're just not ready for it. And I think, you know, that has extended out to other questions, general questions about who we are as neurodivergent people and how do we feel about our neurodivergence within society. Are we ready to be visible, or are we still invisible? And, you know, is society ready for us? And I think it's very thoughtful, your response, Alicia. Has anybody else got any other responses to?
Yeah, Joyce, I was just, I think I've lost my line of thought, but I was just thinking, trying to get my head to understand the term post-traumatic growth. And I was thinking of it as you're lost and then you're finding yourself within that post-trauma and you're growing, and that is a strength because you're finding new ways to overcome this situation that you haven't experienced before. Am I on the correct lines, Alicia? I mean, Doctor, I'm not very good with pronouncing names, sorry.
That's right, Amrita.
Amrita.
Perfect. That's exactly it.
I think
And
because when I first saw that term as a person who's got quite, I found that quite hard to get the meaning from it. But then as you told the story and you illustrated the story the way you did, and linking it then to our own lived experience, it gave me that kind of concept.
Absolutely, you've hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly it. And just to extend upon that a bit more, the post-traumatic growth can be experienced in 5 different ways. That's personal strength, connection with others, spiritual growth, finding new meaning in life, changing career, things like that. And then there was the 6th one, which was the corporeal post-traumatic growth, so through the body. So people develop a different relationship with their body. And then what I proposed was you develop a different relationship with your mind. So that was my finding was cognitive embodied post-traumatic growth. So just moving on to this part of the discussion now, which is staying the course, the road to publication. Kenya alluded to the fact that this is quite an emotive or quite a visceral image. It really, to me, depicts how I felt when I was going through the process of publication. I found it to be absolutely horrendous. Obviously, it was filled with a rainbow at the end of that, in terms of, you know, I found my pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but it was really, really hard, horrendous process. My supervisor, who gave me great support and help, told me, Dr. Kate Heffron told me, that you need to aim high. She said, then you can always choose to come down. What she meant by that was you need, she knew my own personal set of circumstances, and she recognized that I set myself challenges, should I say. And she said to me, if you don't apply for one of the most difficult journals to get into, she said, you will feel very upset with yourself if you don't at least try to go through that process. And she was right. But that process was absolutely horrendous. So to hopefully alleviate Kenya's concerns about the research in terms of the levels of interrogation. My first essay, should we call it, or my research was 20,000 words, and that covered a whole lot of investigation around the deeper meanings of what was going on with my participants. That then came down to 15,000, came down to, at the end, 6,000 words. So that was the manuscript and the length of the manuscript that the journal, the BJHP, would accept. Anything more than that, even considering footnotes or a quote here or there, it would have been completely just excluded. So much so that when you were cutting and pasting the body of the document into the fields of the portal, if you went over, so I think at one point I had 6,010 words, the last 10 words were just erased from my manuscript. And so I had to keep going back and back and back. And one of the reasons, I think very tangentially, and I think by the end of the talk, you'll all start to understand how I think a little bit. The reason why I was saying earlier about, I think in a very hodgepodge way, and everything's a bit like stars in the sky, and then they have to come together in a linear path, which doesn't really make much sense to me. For me, that was just like, I cannot understand how I'm going to do this. How am I going to reduce what might seem easy to some people, 10 words, just take 10 words off what you're saying. To me, it was like, how do I do that? Because each and every one of those 6,010 words has its place and meaning. So for me, somebody who doesn't think in a linear fashion, I couldn't just go to one section of my document. I had to go through the whole document in entirety in order to find out where I could shave a few words off here and there. So that for me was my challenge as a dyslexic person. That for other people, for maybe neurotypical people or people who don't have dyslexia but have other neurodivergent characteristics, that might have been a very easy thing for them to overcome. But for me, that was absolute disaster. And I remember asking Catherine many times, what are your thoughts on this rewrite? And she was like, well, you've lost the meaning here about what you were trying to say. And that I found very, very challenging, because the more I tried to fit in with what the journal guidelines were, the more of myself I was losing and the more of my work I was losing. And that was a very emotional process, because so much of my life, my lived experience of being a doctor with a disability was the background and the formation of the research project. And then I had these 5 very brave doctors and courageous doctors who were talking against the system, which isn't really done. And I felt that I had to honor their lived experience. And by even cutting down words, it just felt like it was a real, it was very painful, should I say.
I'll just say something here. I particularly asked Amrita to talk about her experiences of publication, because I just wanted, because it's important, because that is the next step for a researcher. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Achievability Journal is so different, because it allows people an alternative format. And what Amrita is describing is, one of the hardest to publish in journals. It is quite usual and can be very triggering for neurodivergent people if they're trying to submit any story, narrative, or academic piece of work. And it's actually becomes very torturous, which is what Amrita is talking about at the moment.
So I felt very demoralized. And as Catherine said, it was very triggering. So a lot of the feelings or experiences that I had when I had my diagnosis of epilepsy, when I felt like I was left out of the tribe, when I felt like I was trying to find my own self or reconnect with myself, actually came back, because I thought, I'm having to jump through all of these hoops again just to get somebody else to understand what I'm thinking, when what I'm thinking is actually quite valid, or what I've written is actually valid, but it doesn't align with what somebody else thinks is valid. Does that make sense? So it was having to conform to somebody else's narrative when my narrative was true in the eyes of my 5 participants. So anyway, that was a very difficult process, and it got rejected the first time, or sorry, it got accepted with the, why is this not moving? Sorry. So yes, it got accepted with. Oh no, it's done it in this silly animation thing. Sorry, it's just coming across screen. You don't have to read it. But what I'm trying to show you is that the feedback that I got was extensive. Now, the reason I've put it in this extremely small print is because the feedback that I got fills the whole of this slide. Now, I'm not asking you to read it. I'm just trying to illustrate a point that actually this was very traumatic for me. The level of detail in each of these responses was so critical and so difficult to stomach after all of the hard work that I had done, that actually it made me want to not go through with it. One of the reviewer one actually had some quite positive comments, which was fine, and they were just asking me to do something from a very meticulous point of view, should we say. But the reviewer two, the research comments that they offered, I am sorry, Kenya, I can see you're trying to read it. I have done it. I have put it in small print on purpose because actually the comments were just ridiculous. So anyway, my point is hopefully trying to illustrate that the comments that I received filled this whole slide, and it goes on and on and on. Second reviewers' comments were really harsh. I showed Catherine at the time, obviously, because she helped me counter them. I showed my supervisor, obviously, because she helped me with my research. And they actually gave me that confidence that it wasn't me, it was just somebody else's perspective. And you can't ever change a person's perspective, but recognizing that one person has a lot of power and can influence whether you get published or not meant that I had to conform to their way of thinking. So the very facets of society that I was pushing against by doing my research were the things that I had to conform to get it published, which is very, very tricky to understand. That's true, isn't it, Catherine? Do you remember?
Oh, yes, it's very true. And I think this is actually very usual, what happens during the review process for people if they're trying to get published. You know, sometimes people get lucky and they've got a fairly kind and empathetic panel of editors. But actually, you know, it's more the case that this is what happens, and this is the reason why we have the journal, which most of you came to the launch for. I think what will be interesting now is because we're kind of coming up to the end of the time.
I just before I forget, I just want to say how brave the lady is to bare her soul and share this, and can understand that any word that she felt she couldn't exclude, she was constrained on all sides, all round. And then to come and to share this with us, and we're all different, we're all unique, and we're all different, and we all have a different way of seeing and perceiving things. And I just wanted to say I'm so grateful for you for sharing this with us, and you did really, really well, and you deserve a round of applause.
And I think,
thank you, Joyce.
I think that actually, you know, I think we all feel that, Amrita, and I think that nicely comes up to the next part because we are running out of time.
Sorry, yes, I appreciate that.
Is for you to tell us what has happened next. And you have got some questions that people wanted to ask you right at the beginning. You've got one from Andrew about opinion within the medical profession and what happens when there's a difference, and one from Joyce, which is about issues of conflict. So you know, you've got some questions there as well.
Sure. So this is my published journal. So if anyone does want to take, sorry, not journal, manuscript. So if anyone does want to have a look, I put the QR code there so you can just get it on your phone immediately. But it is very difficult being a doctor who is different, very. The way in which we are trained is completely linear. The way in which we have to conform to specific curriculum, competencies, revalidation, appraisal, it is all very linear and formulaic. And that can be very difficult for people. Now, add into that neurodivergence, and on top of that, chronic disability, and it is near enough impossible. And that is really the rationale and the reason as to why I wanted to be working for the disabled, not working, sorry, volunteering for the Disabled Doctors Network, because there are too many doctors who are suffering who don't have a voice. And we don't have a voice because of the discrimination and the marginalisation and the threat of losing our careers. And that needs to change. So in a very short few sentences, Andrew, it is very difficult to be a doctor who is different. And I'm saying different because that different could be anything, whether it be from an ethnic minority, whether it be from a different sexual orientation, whether it be from a different way of identifying as a gender, whether it be, you know, neurodiversity, whatever it is, ... it is difficult. I just wanted to say as well, Catherine, I don't know if you know, but my article was the most downloaded article, was published between 2022 and 2023 from Wiley.
Oh, good for you. Good for you.
I
Brilliant.
just thought I'd mention that. And then
Alicia's got her hand raised. Alicia?
Yes, Alicia, sorry.
Sorry, I'm saying the wrong name, sorry. Amrita.
Amrita.
I just wanted to know, you know, with the change, when you were to make the change, the pushback into, you had to form, how did you, what was it that gave you the strength? Was it being dyslexic? Because is that the creative part? Is that the bit where you said, okay, I can use this weakness as a strength and push through? What was it?
Honestly, Alicia, it was love. That was why I made such a big deal about it at the beginning.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So kind of this shows you my tangential thoughts. So I have all the thoughts up there, I put them out, and then at the end they make sense. But it's love, genuinely. My husband, my sister, my children, my mother. I'm very lucky.
Oh, I see it.
So empathy and care and love are huge parts of our lives and need to be nurtured. Now, Joyce, you had the question about issues about conflict in the medical profession. Joyce.
Did you want to rephrase? Were you going to ask a question, or would you like me to just take the question that you asked earlier?
Take the question that Roy Joyce asked earlier.
Sure. Sorry, Joyce, we're going to say something.
Sorry.
So the conflict that occurs between being a doctor-patient.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it's terrible. Terrible. It's very difficult because and I can only speak from the point of view of myself and also from the point of view of the people who I researched, that going from a place of being normative without having any difficulties, I mean, in terms of health, to going to a place where you do, it completely changes not just your identity in terms of how you present to the world, but also how you became a doctor. So when you are learning to be a doctor, you see things through a different lens. When you don't have any ailments, when you don't have any pain, when you haven't been experiencing whatever health condition one might feel, you might learn about it in a very different way, a little bit removed, one step removed from what it is. But when you start to develop symptoms or you start to develop an illness, obviously your empathy, your compassion, your understanding increases, and you realize how much of your learning you missed out by not having the insider knowledge and by not having the perspective. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is recognizing the humanity that exists within us all. We are all equal and that we are all fragile. And I think sometimes when you're in an environment where you are learning how to care for others, you forget that at times you might be one of those others. And that is a very difficult bridge to cross. It's a very important bridge to cross. But when you haven't had experience of it, you don't know that it's there. It's that Johari's window. You don't know what you don't know. And actually, that's a really, really difficult place to be in. So part of this journey, Kenya, when I was talking about the importance of post-traumatic growth in this group of people, was because it was about that collision, that eliding of the personal and the professional self, because for such a long time, the professional self was given far more priority than the personal self. But there was a massive lag in the development of that human being, because their technical, their academic self was being accelerated, but their compassionate, loving self was left behind. And that was the focus of the study. The focus of the study was on the person, the post-traumatic growth, not the definition of disability, if that makes sense. It was almost how disability makes us better people. That was the post-traumatic growth. How do we use that acquired disability to elevate ourselves, not to hinder ourselves? How do we utilize that?
Very well put. Actually, a good summary. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what happens next?
What happened next is very exciting. Catherine has allowed me to gain confidence in my abilities and gain confidence in what I have done and what I can offer people. And the biggest lesson for me was being a doctor doesn't mean that you have to sit in a consultation room with people. Being a doctor is about helping people, and you can do that in different ways. So I use my skills to speak up, I advocate. So I was invited to the GMC symposium, speaking on behalf of the Disabled Doctors Network. That's the picture in the middle. I offered a TEDx talk where I spoke about my own personal journey. So my research is about the journey of others. In my TEDx talk, I talk about my journey. I've been also offered the opportunity to speak at the NHS Disability Conference, an RCGP Summit, membership summit. And I do a lot of public speaking now, which I absolutely love. I do a lot of education, work